Welcome everybody to the last session of Parenting for Character in 2020. This last session that Dr. Andy Mullins will be taking us through is raising teenagers with strength of character. And so I would ask everyone to mute themselves during Andy's presentation. Please feel free to send through any questions that you may have, send them through to me, and I can pose them to Andy. And then during the presentation, if you have your video off and you turn your video on at the end during question time, that would be fantastic, so that Andy can see all of you as he replies to your questions. We are recording this and we will have them on Andy's YouTube channel for people to be able to watch it and review some of the comments made by Andy during the talk. So first and foremost, we'll start off with Andy's talk, and then we'll have 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions. So please send your questions through. Andy, I'll hand it over to you.
Good on you, mate. Let's do the share screen. And here we go. Okay. Well, thanks for having me back. I realise this is a grand day in Australian Kiwi relations because the football game this afternoon. So, best of luck, guys. I know we're playing in your killer home ground, so we'll see how we go. I've put strength of character there because in the end, we've been talking consistently over these 3 sessions after this about the 4 strengths of character, the cardinal virtues, and how we can inculcate these in young people. And I think in the end, you and I, adults or teenagers, we realise that one of the great challenges is that we use our courage in order to do good in the world. We don't just use our courage to feather our own nests or to pursue the 3 Ps, if you like, of pleasure and possessions and power. If we use our strength of character for self-indulgent or selfish goals, there's something wrong with that. We don't feel right with that. So that's the first thing that I wanted you to think about, that the young people in your care, it's not just about raising them so that they've got fortitude, it's about raising them so that they can use their fortitude to do something good. This is a tough story, this one. The lady there, her name is Angela Wood. She's talking to the school captains of the school where I was involved in Sydney for a long time. And Angela is the mother of a girl who had passed away the year before from an ecstasy overdose. And the little girl's name was Anna Wood, and she was 14. So she was a very early teenager. But she took 1 pill and it took her life. And you realize that by the time a young person is 13, 14, 15, they're making decisions now in our society where it will change their life, and it could be catastrophic. So there isn't much time. We can't think that I've still got my teenagers still at home, so thank goodness. Well, no, they're making decisions even when they're 12, 13, 14 that are going to change their lives in some way or other. So we've got to be part of that discussion. I wanted to show you 2 slides now about, I suppose, heroes, and see what are we aiming for here. If you have not seen this movie, you might like to get it out on a Friday night and look at it together. It was nominated a few years ago as the best foreign picture. So it's a very high quality picture. It's called Sophie Shoulder Final Days. Sophie was a 21-year-old girl in 1943 who, with her brother, pamphleted against the Nazis. But she did it from the highest conviction. It wasn't an impulsive reaction. It was something that she thought about. She and her brother acted from the highest intentions, and in the end they got caught. And the court scene in the movie is actually a reconstruction from the actual court transcripts, so it's very accurate to what happened in reality. And here we're looking at a young man and a young girl who basically had the strength of character that you and I would love to see in your children, in the students that we teach or whatever, right? I mean, how do we raise kids so that they've got this gumption? We're going to look at a little bit of it, a few minutes only.
Zu beschimpfen! Ich war in Austron. Wie viele der Zuhörer hier. Sie nicht. Ich habe Ströme von Blut in Polen und in Russland mit eigenen Augen sehen müssen. Ich habe sehen müssen, wie Frauen und Kinder von deutschen Soldaten erschossen wurden. Ja, sind Sie denn so blöde, dass Sie annehmen können, dass auch nur ein einziger Volksgenosse Ihnen das glaubt? Wenn Hitler und Sie nicht Angst vor unserer Meinung hätten, würden wir hier nicht stehen. Ach, halten Sie doch den Mund! Das ist doch sowieso ehrloser Lump! Sie sind doch nur ein Dummkopf und ein mieser Verräter! Ende der Vernehmung! Noch Fragen? Nein. Keine Fragen, Herr Präsident. Schon, Hans, zurück in die Bank. Sophia Scholl. Schämen Sie sich denn nicht, dass Sie Flugblätter hochverräterischen Inhalts in der Universität verbreitet haben?
Nein, ich schäme mich nicht.
In den Lichthof geworfen, einfach so.
Nicht einfach so, sondern um auch noch die letzten
Reden Sie lauter, man kann Sie ja kaum verstehen.
Ich wollte auch noch die letzten Flugblätter verbreiten, damit unsere Idee so schnell wie möglich...
Diesen Dreck hier Idee nennen, das sieht Vollidioten ähnlich, aber nicht deutschen Studenten.
Wir kämpfen mit dem Wort.
Da schreiben Sie doch tatsächlich: Darum trennt euch von dem nationalsozialistischen Untermenschentum. Schauen Sie sich das selber an, da sehen Sie den Untermenschen. Wo haben Sie eigentlich das Papier für diese Pamphlete her?
Gekauft und aus der Universität.
So, aus der Universität. Heimtückischer Diebstahl von Volksgut. Papier, gerade Papier, das so knapp ist. Das sieht natürlich Hochverrätern ähnlich.
Mein Bruder und ich haben versucht, mit den Flugblättern den Menschen die Augen zu öffnen. Und das furchtbare Blutbad an anderen Völkern und den Juden früher zu beenden, als es ohnehin von den Alliierten beendet wird. Sollen wir denn auf ewig das vor aller Welt ausgestoßene und gehasste Volk sein?
Ach, ein Herrenvolk interessiert das nicht.
Ihr Herrenvolk will in Wirklichkeit Frieden. Und dass die Menschenwürde wieder Achtung findet. Es will Gott, Gewissen, Mitgefühl.
Ja, was bilden Sie sich denn ein?
Isn't it remarkable? What a remarkable... That transcript is almost virtually exactly what happened in the court. And it makes you think, doesn't it? It makes you think immensely about how do we raise people so that they have that sort of strength against ideology which is corrupt. And we're seeing some of this around us in our own countries. And this is very relevant. You know, you're raising your kids to change the world for the better. And if you don't succeed in doing that, you will feel you have failed as a parent. And of course, to raise young people to speak up like that, we need to be courageous. Their father was a conscientious objector in the First World War. And afterwards, he encouraged his kids to read broadly and to read. So in the end, this 21-year-old girl has been reading Aquinas, Augustine, Cardinal Newman, and they're not even a Catholic family. It's incredible. On her day that she was executed, she actually asked to become Catholic. It makes you think, right?
Wow.
This is in fact now the bravest person I think I have ever met. His name is James Mawdsley. He was the cousin of the first school captain at Redfield. So where that picture that you saw a couple of minutes ago. And James went back to Burma 3 times to get himself arrested. In the process, he came back to his Christian faith. He got himself arrested 3 times, and the 3rd time he organised the House of Lords, he organised journalists, he organised the UN, he organised Congress in the US. to put pressure on the military junta that had Aung San in prison for 15 years or whatever it was. And just listen to a couple of words from him.
Hi, I'm James Mawdsley, a good friend of Josh, and if he tries to recruit any of you to go and show solidarity with people suffering abroad with a high risk of being arrested by some oppressive regime, then I can highly recommend it. It's you get exclusive accommodation, 24-hour room service, which can be a bit tardy, and I assure you it's one of the best places for Bible study and for prayer, because it will focus your mind. And be deeply aware that we're not just going out there to give of our strength to help people who are suffering. We're going there also to learn about resilience, courage, humility, deference, qualities which people in the developing world often abound in, and which we need to learn from them and import back into our own societies, so we might be able to overcome the tyranny we suffer, which is often tyranny of materialism and addiction. So if Josh sounds like he has a crazy scheme going, well, we're both 100% behind it, and we think it can work for people abroad and work for us at home too. God bless.
I actually don't know what that crazy scheme was. His brother Josh that he's referring to it's his twin brother who's a military officer, and this is after he's come back the third time. He ran for Parliament, didn't get in, and then some years later he trained to be a Catholic priest, and he's now a Catholic priest, James. And I've had young people go over and see him in the last year. But again, enormously impressive, I find. And what does this contrast with? You know, George Street is the street with all the cinemas in Sydney. And, you know, true story, one of the last times I was in Sydney, driving across George Street at 7 o'clock at night. And there's a pub there on the corner of the street that I'm stopped at the stoplights. And there's girls there, probably 14, 15 possibly, but tarted up, you know, with lipstick and short dresses, and boys all over them on the sidewalk. And I'm thinking, what is going on? Where are your fathers? How do your fathers love you so little that they allow you to be so abused in this way? So there's still a massive role for parents when there are teenagers at home, but the parents have to be in the game. You know, we're playing for keeps. That's not somewhere in Germany or Denmark. That is next to the school where I spent a lot of time. Like the last 4 years I was in Sydney, I was a principal of a school in the west of Sydney, and that is the stage at the Regatta Park where the Olympic rowing was held in Penrith, which is next to the school practically. But what is the message of that stage? This is what we're pushing. This is what we're peddling to the young adults in our society. And are we going to live with this? Are we happy with it? You know? And of course, we've got to fortify our own kids first, and then maybe we can do something about what's happening in the world around us. But we've got to fortify our own kids. Otherwise, the teenagers that we're raising are just guinea pigs. You know, everybody's got massive ideals. These young people have got such great ideals to change the world for the better. And in the end, that's what we give them. You know, I mean, this you know, DEFCON dance festival is not put together by 20-year-olds. It's put together by 40 or 50-year-olds. This is what the adults in our society are dishing out to our teenagers. So we've got to think about this, you know, and the breakdown of our family and television is obvious. Netflix, you know, everybody's complaining about Netflix now, but more deeply, you know, I think we would all agree that there's a profound self-centeredness that is developing in our society. Now, I'm putting all the negatives first, and most of this talk will not be negatives, but it's important we know what we're up against and what pressures are on the young people in our care. You know, we've got enormous pressures just to act on impulse, and we're seeing this constantly in advertisements on television, advertisements in the magazines, in glossy magazines, the pressure of consumerism. Look at the Banksy graffiti, right? Of, you know, he's taken the idea of the raft, these people lost at sea, and he's changed it into where they're just trying to summon the cruiser going past that couldn't care less. So there's something big happening, you know, that we're betraying people. We're raising them so that they're really obedient little consumers. And we've got to lead the way somehow, obviously, if we don't want our kids to fall into this trap. You go into Melbourne Airport. If you go past McDonald's in Melbourne Airport into the in the direction of the men's and women's toilets in Terminal 4, a whole wall has a massive sign plastered on it saying, "I love to shop." Well, in the end, this is the message we're giving the young people in our care. Miranda Devine is an Australian journalist who's working over in the States at the moment. But that expression of hers caught my eye, that children in our society have become canaries in the coal mine of a sex-soaked culture. And what are canaries in a coal mine? They're designed to die. We bring them down the coal mine in a cage so that when the air gets bad and they fall off their perch, we know that it's not good for us to breathe. So somehow we're sacrificing our kids in this society. Are we happy to do that? The Banksy cartoon there, what's it showing? It's showing that love has just become bodily interaction, that there's no personal interaction. And what does this lead to? It leads to enormous cynicism. I like that quote because it captures something. Most of my academic background in recent years has been moral philosophy, but philosophy, not theology. But there's a great truth at the center of that comes out of philosophy, that without spiritual values in the broadest sense in the world, you cannot have truth. And when God is no longer at the center of human life, St. John Paul said, then life itself is empty and meaningless. We've got to think about what's going on around us. Why have we got democracies that are passing laws now that for 2,000 years no government has ever had the temerity to pass? But now we've got governments passing laws about euthanasia and about abortion and about numerous other things that are just completely corrupt and immoral as behaviours. For 2,000 years, no government, let alone a democracy, has passed those laws. But now in the last 40 years, we're seeing this. This is the world you're raising your kids in. And if we don't want them to succumb to it, we've got to raise them with depth of spiritual values. And by that, I mean all that is good in the human spirit, not simply that they believe in God, but something, I shouldn't say deeper than that, but that we give them the whole breadth of culture. We're in a world where young people are very lonely. Look where Hayden Ramsey, who's a good friend here who was running the University of Notre Dame in Sydney. He said, on entering adolescence, every young person is inducted into two ways of thinking. An ethic of relativism, which is basically, well, you've got your values, but I've got mine. And sorry, my values are different to yours. And an ethic of autonomy, which is, I'll do what I want. But in both cases, it's an ethic of loneliness. And you've got to be close to your kids. If you're not close to your kids, you cannot prepare your kids for adult life. And you can't be close to your kids by telling them what to do all the time. It's got to be a lot more of an interactive dynamic than that. There was a book that came out of the States years ago called The Nurture Assumption, but it was a very sad book, really, a very famous book, but very sad because it said no matter how hard parents try, they will not be able to overcome the peer group. And your kids are susceptible to this. How do you raise your kids so that they're fortified against a peer group which is cynical, a peer group which doesn't have any spiritual values, that's just drawn into consumerism, that's just drawn into impulse? So this is your task as a parent. And in the end, of course, you and I know that if we get dragged in and our emotions are activated, and that emotion is very good, it helps us to relate to people deeply. But if our passion clouds our reason, we cannot think straight. And so you have to teach your kids to be able to think straight in a world that's not thinking straight. And I don't want to be negative, but there are big challenges there, obviously, where we want to bring this world with us. We don't want to just sort of hide away and create a little enclave where people raise their kids well. That's never going to happen. Plutarch. This is the most beautiful quote that I know about. This is the most beautiful definition of adolescence. He says, for intelligent people, the passage from childhood to adulthood is not an abandonment of rules, but a change of ruler. Who's the new ruler? The young person themselves. They have to run their own life. But to rule, you have to have command of reality. You have to know what the facts are. You have to have a habit of setting good goals for oneself. If you don't raise kids so that they have the capacity to set goals for themselves, then they won't be able to run their own lives. This is not a new problem. Look at, 800 BC. I see no hope for the future of our people. The frivolous youth of today, youth are reckless beyond words. When I was young, we were discreet and respectful. This is 800 BC. Nothing's changed. Socrates says in 400 BC, children now love luxury. They don't respect their elders. They're tyrants. They no longer rise when their elders enter the room. I mean, what's changed? 1000. Young people of today think of nothing but themselves. They have no reverence for their parents. So in the end, the challenges we're facing with young people have always been there. And it's always been a challenge for parents to be in the world of their kids. But you have to take up the challenge. What will it be? Will it be kids with no future, or do we make the future now? Again, Banksy, right? I mean, he's got his capacity, doesn't he, to sum things up, and somehow, already even a little child floating a balloon. The writing is on the wall unless we do something about this. And I don't want to be negative. Let's go to a positive view of adolescence. A game changer for me, I was sent across by the Parents for Education Foundation in 1993 to San Francisco to do a week-long course with this guy, David Isaacs, who wrote a book called Character Building, which is one of the real seminal books about character education. I recommend it very highly. And he said, look, and it was an eye-opener because everyone's got this negative view of adolescence, where adolescence is all about these things, superficial features like kids are very emotional and, in the end they do things impulsively and they spend all the time looking in the mirror and they're insecure and they want to do anything to impress for acceptance and they take risks and all of that. They're the sort of that's the standard mantra about what teenagers do. And then he says, well, hang on. There's two massive outcomes in adolescence that make it a marvelous time. And I think back to, you think back to when you were in year 10 or 11 at school, and it was a wonderful time. Why? Because we discovered the fact that we could set our own goals in life. We had our lives ahead of us. It was the discovery of personal intimacy, that I can love whatever and whoever I like, and hopefully I make the right decisions. And it was a time when we developed the capacity to think for ourselves and to think critically. That David Isaacs says it's a time when we settle on the values that we want for life. And, a person has not come out of adolescence until they have the values. They've decided what values they want for life. And there's a lot of truth in that. And you realize there's people in their 20s who are still drifting around, and some people come out of it later. They really do dumb things in their early 20s and then they settle down, but hopefully in their teenage years, in a guided way, when they're in your care, your teenagers can make mistakes. And by the time they leave your care, they're now set and secure in values that they want in the world. We know there's all sorts of neural things. I won't go into that now, but I took a lot of slides out. I had ready actually for this presentation. I took them out because we don't have time, but they know a lot now about why teenagers act impulsively. In a sense, why, but in the end, that's not an excuse. And kids who act impulsively can be the Anna Woods who in the end make decisions that completely change their lives. So, we can't use this as an excuse for teenage misbehavior. We've got to use it as a reason to get in while their brain is still molding, if you like. Okay, so the first goal is have a positive view yourself, and that will come through the pores of your skin at home, that you're not negative about teenage life. But then we've got to show, you and I have to show, when we have young people around us, that our values bring us happiness. If you get around with a frown on your face, if you're stressed, if you're always worried about the world, if you're complaining about, I mean, we're complaining a lot about the lockdown in Melbourne, right? But I mean, in the end, if you do too much complaining when you get young people around you, it's It's in the end, you're going to get that response. This marvelous woman who's now passed away was a great advocate for kids on the street and kids in courts. And she said, why should children be happy with their lot when parents complain about theirs? So if you want to raise kids that are happy, you've got to be happy. If you've got to raise kids with peace of heart, you've got to have peace of heart. If you want to raise kids that are not cynical, you can't be cynical. And the culture in the family is your responsibility, nobody else's. It's big, isn't it? Don't you love that? Doesn't that bring back all sorts of memories? It brings back all sorts of memories for me, that picture about silly childhood television. So we might have used that slide before, but I wanted to come back to it. You know, you've got to remember that your face, more than anything, you and what's going on your face, the 200 square centimeters of your face, that's responsible for setting the culture in your home. If, you know, when you greet your kids in the morning, when you greet your kids in the evening at the dinner table, if your demeanor is not welcoming, if your face, if your smile is not a bridge, which is what Mother Teresa used to say, if you don't have a face that people want to connect with, then you will lose your kids. And mums and dads have to help each other. It's too important. Another big factor is that we have to keep reminding ourselves kids are changing on the inside. I remember this vividly, that one young man I was teaching was in year 9. So year 9 is already 14, 15, right? And he's a great young man, clever. And you realize any boy, any male knows that a 14 or 15-year-old boy is very different to a 12-year-old boy, right? Completely different. But his mother said to me once, oh, I think he's still the same child that he was 4 years ago, because he still paints Warhammer figures and that's his hobby, and he doesn't have a girlfriend yet. And I'm thinking, he's not the same guy. It's all happening on the inside. And you and I have to keep reminding ourselves that when a little girl is 10, 11, 12, she's different. Maybe she will be a bit antsy or whatever, and you realize she's different. But just because it's not coming out completely in behavior doesn't mean there's not a turmoil going on inside. You know, I've taught kids who are cutting themselves when they're in year 8. What's going on? You know, peace cannot be kept by force, but it must be kept by understanding, you know. So this is a big challenge. Are you listening to your kids? Do you know your kids? You know, I mean, it's a big issue. Require teenagers to think, not to do. How's this story? True story. Young guy that I taught, after he left school, he joined the police force. And he and his fellow policemen were on duty in a shopping centre in sort of tough area of Sydney. And then suddenly they realise there's a kid in front of us. He's like 14 and he's waving a gun around, and he's about to pull his gun and plug this kid because the kid is pointing a gun at him. And then the kid sort of stops and he starts to wave it around again and says, oh, it's only a replica. Soon afterwards, my ex-student left the police force. That was too much, right? But you realise kids are so impulsive. So we have to teach them to think. David Isaac says the most important virtue for teenagers is prudence. Teach them to think. Teach them to think critically. Teach them to set goals for themselves. Require teenagers to think, not to do is from David Isaacs, is his saying, but I think it's a very, very useful idea. I'll give you another example. And because this has to come out every day in your family if you've got teenagers at home. Another young man told me this true story, and thank God it's all turned out very well. But when he was 19, so he's already very late teenager, right? But he's way too intimate with his girlfriend, and his girlfriend's expecting, and he doesn't know how to talk to his parents about that. He's still living at home, and he goes into himself, and night after night for probably 2 or 3 weeks, he's just sitting at the dinner table, not communicating. He's morose. He has no idea how do I even start to deal with this. And then his mother gets sick of this, and his mother blurts out at the dinner table, what is wrong with you? You're acting like you've made a girl pregnant or something. And he looks up at his mother and he says, Mum, I have. And she bursts into tears and leaves the table. The sisters squeal and leave the table. And he's left there with his dad. And then his dad says to him, there's a pause, and his dad says to him, okay, my boy, what are you going to do now? And then his dad helps him think it through. And the way this young man told me that story, he was so grateful to his dad for that reaction. So how do you react when your kids tell you tough stuff? You've got to be there for them. Remember, kids are lonely. They don't know where to turn. And if you're not the one that they can turn to, it's a catastrophe. When you Google Lost in the Temple, you get some sort of Raiders of the Lost Ark type image on Google. It sort of doesn't quite get it. But, and again, this is not a theological truth that I'm about to put in front of you, but it comes out of the Gospels. The only story we have about perfect parenting of teenagers that I'm aware of in the Gospel comes from the moment when our Lord is lost, and for 3 days, Mary and Joseph are looking for him. And finally, they find him in the temple. And remember that Jesus is only 12, but his parents, who are like perfect parents, have raised him so he can cope on his own. He's not doing dumb stuff. For 3 days, he's known how to look after himself, which says a lot straight away. They didn't over-supervise him. They weren't helicopter parents. But they had raised him so he can make all the right choices. What else happens? Mum does the talking. Dad doesn't do the talking. Dad doesn't overplay his hand. What are the questions that Mary asks? Because she's a perfect parent and she's talking to a perfect child, but she's doing what a perfect parent would do. She says, why have you done this? So she's asking her son to reflect on the causes of his behavior. So with our teenagers, help them understand why they do things. And secondly, she says, do you know how worried we have been? So the most important reason to give young people is how their actions impact on others. And this is the virtue of justice, it's the virtue of charity. If you don't get young people to understand that the most important value in life is how their actions impact on others and how they have a duty to care for others, then you miss the bus. This is big. We have to keep coming back to this idea of causes and consequences, and the consequences focused on how our actions impact on others. You know, I mean, we all get that face, right, when we're teenagers, right? But think about it, you know. You have to coach your young people to set goals for themselves. Keep coming back to prudence, sound judgment. Keep consulting your teenagers so that they get input into the decision making. You're teaching them how to make decisions, so you can't just hand them pre-made decisions. Teach them how to plan. Teach them how to break problems into small bits so they can solve them. Teach them to be objective about what are the facts. You know, the family education approach as in FEA. You know, when they have a case study, when you have a case study, you go, what are the facts, what are the problems, what are the solutions? Well, this idea of helping young people to look for the facts is so basic to good decision making, isn't it? And when the school report comes home, sit on the same side of the table. Don't sit opposite, but ask your teenager, what do you like out of the report? What would you like to improve in? But, you know, ask both questions. Don't just say you've got to improve in this. Remember, it's all about internalizing what's going on, that you're no longer the ruler in this young person's life. They are ruling their own life. So you have to help them set the right goals. I might have told this story before, but it's worth telling again. One of the most impressive families I've ever taught, I asked the father, wow, what's your secret? And he said, when my son was in year 7, I had to talk to him calmly but seriously. He never raised his voice, this father. I had to talk to him seriously about something I wasn't happy with. And when I spoke to him, he had tears in his eyes. And I thought to myself, I'm so proud of you, my boy. You have such a good heart. But then 1 week later, the same behaviours started coming back. And then the father said to me, I realize it's not my boy's problem, it's my problem. I have to give him more support. He has a good heart. Therefore, what I have to do is give him more backup. And from that moment, every week he would sit down with his son or go for a walk or go to Macca's or something and help his son have a goal for the week. And it was going to be his son's goal. And by the time I was talking to the father, 5 years on, we could see the wonderful effect that this had had, helping his son set goals for himself each week. So think about how you internalize the process with your own kids. You know, habits of communication, not just one-offs. This guy, Ross Campbell, wrote a book called How to Really Love Your Teenager, which is one of the highest selling parenting books in history. And it's a fantastic book. And he says most adolescent problems, most problems with teenagers are solved by fixing your relationship with them. So it's not your child's problem, it's your duty. He says it's not the child's duty to emotionally nourish the parent. It's the parent's duty to emotionally nourish the child. So in the end, if you get cranky, you're not emotionally nourishing your child, you know. It's a big, big issue. We had a survey at one of the schools that I was at, and we surveyed all the secondary kids about how well they communicated with their parents, mums and dads. So clear is that when kids used to felt really guilty. When older children were berated by their parents, as in angry parents, they blamed their parents for not having more self-control. So there's something happening there that kids are starting to sit in judgment of their parents as they get older into adolescence if their parents are not showing self-control. Also, we noticed that there was a great polarization by the time kids were in 9 and 10 and 11 and 12, the older adolescent years. The line to their mums and dads was either improving or dropping out. Mums had a secret. In most cases, mums were communicating better with their boys. This was a boys' survey. But in most cases, mums were communicating with their boys better because they had a secret weapon, and that was food. And the best time for mums to communicate with their kids was after school, when the kids get home and you got them one-on-one and you give them something nice to eat and you chat with them. Mrs. Cosgrove, a woman who raised a family of boys in such a humble farm that rooms in the house were dirt floors. And I said to her once, you know, you've done a good job. I knew her sons at uni, they were great kids. And she said, when one of my boys comes home and he looks preoccupied, he looks like he's got something on his mind, what do you think she's going to say? She's going to say, well, what's the problem? No, she doesn't say, what's the problem? She says, I put on the kettle, I give him a cup of tea, and I tell him a good story. And then by the end of that process, the boy wants to talk. How clever are you at pulling your sons and daughters' tongues so they want to talk? That slide will be available. It's just, there's some good tips there. That comes from a book called How to Really Love, it's called Back to the Family by Ray Guarendi, who's a psychologist. And he says, you know, you've got to listen, you've got to listen, you've got to listen. Understand your kids, don't jump in. Listen, hear them out. Talk to them at the right times. Find other ways to show affection and keep asking your child's opinion. Oh no, did you watch the bunnies last night? Oh, so close. It just looked like they hadn't taken their pep pills after they played so well the last couple of weeks. Anyway, but this comes from Phil Gould, who used to teach them. He said, life is not a video. You can't replay it. You can't put it on pause. It's gone, it's gone. You only get one shot. And with teenagers, that's also true. That if you don't spot something and you don't react to it, you may only get that chance to deal with it. You know, you may only get a sniff that there's something happening that you're not aware of, and you need to be close enough to your kids you can talk about it. How do you know what your kids are looking at on the internet if they don't tell you? How do you know? You don't know. I mean, even if you have the world's best filter system at home, the kids go over to their friends' places or they're on their phone or something, right? if your kids don't open their hearts to you, you don't know what's going on in their lives and you're out of the game. So in order to educate your kids, which is a great task of raising teenagers, to educate minds, they have to open their minds to you. Otherwise, you don't know what's happening. Father Chris Riley put in a lot of work with youth off the streets in Sydney. He's actually very unwell at the moment, but he came and spoke at Redfield, and very impressive man. And I'd love to tell you a few more stories about him, but he just comes out with this saying in the middle of when he's talking to parents and seniors, and he says, look, parents have the courage to demand greatness from the children in your care, but you can't demand anything if you're not close to your kids. You can't do it. They're just going to argue back. If you need to say no, you got to say no. But what do you say no to? David Isaac says, only say no when it's a question of physical or moral danger. And then explain the reason simply and clearly, and then change the subject. He says, follow the 3 C's of communication. Be clear, be concise, and then change the subject. But be very clear, because the kids afterwards are going to have to run their own lives. So they need to know what's right and wrong. One parent told me, a man who was raised in communist China, but obviously his parents had a lot of savvy, right? And he said to me, when I left home at 17, my father said to me, my son, now that you're leaving home, I need to tell you 3 things. I need to tell you, don't gamble, don't do drugs, and don't play around with sex, because you will need to be faithful to the woman that you marry. This is communist China. No Christian faith. But isn't that impressive that he's speaking so bluntly to his son, and his son never forgot it? So having conversations is really important with a teenager, because you're giving them a guidebook for life. Look at Horace down the bottom there. Horace is, I think I've dropped off a number there, 65 to 8 doesn't. Oh, that looks right, doesn't it? Yeah, so he's about 53 or something. My father was accustomed to shape me as a boy by words. Horace was an old soldier. He also turned out as one of the most important lyric poets of the great golden age of Roman literature. My father was accustomed to shape me as a boy by words. So are you shaping your kids with heartfelt conversations where you listen as well as talk? And, do you find a way in the course of the 2 or 3 years where you've got teenagers in your care that you cover all of these topics and you give them really good reasons? You don't shoot from the hip. You've prepared it beforehand. You can give them good reasons why euthanasia is dumb, why we can never compromise on the truth, why if you don't live for yourself, you live for others, or the other way around. If you don't live for others, you live for yourself, right? That there's more happiness in giving than receiving. And they're words of our Lord himself, right? That life is about relationships, it's not about possessions. That genuine love brings suffering, but that's fine. It's part of the deal. If you don't love, you don't suffer as much, maybe, but you've lost something terribly important in your life. More ones, attach yourself to the best people you know. That work is service. Are you having these conversations with your kids? If kids don't think that work is service, they will think that work is about self-aggrandizement with possessions and money. They will become more and more selfish the more money they get in their pay packet, unless they have learned when they were young that work is service. Creativity in friendships. Stay in touch with our friends. Everybody deserves respect. Right and wrong are absolutes. And, our governments have forgotten this. They think that right and wrong are determined by plebiscites. Right and wrong are not determined by plebiscites. They're determined by the natural law, the law of what is good for human nature. It's loopy, you know, what's happened in our democracies in the last 40 years is loopy. And we have to raise our kids so that they're strong against this trend, which is essentially it's a trend to relativism that you know, whoever has the numbers is right. This comes from, again, it looks like it's a theological quote. It's not. It's a quote about raising kids. And Pope Benedict hits this nail on the head when he says, look, if we want to raise our kids to use their mobile phones well, he said, the role of parents is of primary importance. They have the right and duty to ensure the prudent use of media by training the conscience of their children to make good judgments. So in other words, obviously kids are in a world where they're going to have a smartphone, but they're going to have a smartphone, please, when their conscience is telling them the right things. If you give kids a smartphone before their conscience is telling them the right things, you'll get a catastrophe. And I've seen it. I've had parents in my room at school explaining to them, listen, your son's had pornography on his phone. We've taken it off him. Here's the phone, but you need to have some really good ongoing discussions with your child. 2 weeks later, the child had the phone back in his possession. You cannot train a conscience in 2 weeks. And 2 years later, that child who was in year 10 had an active sexual relationship with a girl. I mean, what's going on? You know, I mean, if kids don't open their hearts to us, we can't train them. We can't talk to them. Affection is big. That's Ross Campbell again. You fix the adult-child relationship by affection, by affection, by affection. And you've got to manage the inputs, manage the peer group, do something about it, act. You know, don't just wish your son's friends were better. You know, a friend of mine, basically, one thing he did, he realized his 14-year-old boy was in a wrong group. This is a guy I went to school with. And he told me the story about how he knew his son loved the water, so he bought a boat. And he and his son spent the next 2 years weekends on the boat. And they got very close to each other. And then his son changed his peer group. With his peer group, he'd starting to do marijuana, he'd been starting to drink, you know, outside of the supervision of his parents. And 2 years later, problem solved, Dad sold the boat, problem solved. But you got to take action if you realize your kids are going off the track. You can't just wish it was different. Resilience is big. And why do we have kids with resilience problems? Because they're focused, they've been raised, and sorry, this is simplistic. So, you know, and I realize, you know, in every family there can be resilience problems. And certainly in my family, I'm aware of resilience problems, right? But one of the big reasons that resilience problems come up is because we've raised kids so that they make themselves the center of their thoughts. There's more happiness in giving than receiving. So we've got to raise kids to find happiness in doing things for others. And that's why I put that slide there. You know, have you got a game plan to teach your kids to find the joy in serving others? And obviously the great way that you serve others is in family and in your, you know, the way you model this with your spouse is crucial. That you know, that if you can communicate by the depth of your love for each other, this is what family is. This is what a mature, intimate relationship is, that you live for each other, then you're well on the way. You know, there's two things you're going to look back on, aren't there? When you look back and you sort of give yourself a grade for your parenting, it's going to be, did you raise your kids so that they adopted values with enormous depth in their lives? And they'll probably be your values, right? And secondly, did you raise your kids so that they were capable of permanent, loving relationships? If you can tick those two boxes, you've done pretty well. And you and your relationship have to show that the love doesn't run out. If you can possibly do that. That quote from Plutarch sort of has got to make us think, doesn't it? That we've got to, you know, we can't look for emotional nourishment outside of our homes. That is nonsense. And, you know, those two young men there, they're Columbine killers, right? There's all sorts of tragedies that we've seen, right? You've got to be closer to the opposition. closer than the opposition to your kids. You've got to know what your kids are thinking so that you can guide them. You've got to warm their hearts up so that they see that life is about reaching out to others, not about feeling victimized. And you and I have to make sure that even the tough things that happen in our own lives, the loss of a parent, the loss of, whatever tragedy happens in your life as a parent, you're teaching your child how to cope with difficulties and tragedies. So your peace of heart in the face of the greatest difficulties, and I've got plenty of stories there, and I will finish with one story. But, tough story, but one young man who I taught, who went through a very tough time because his family lost everything, and he'd been spoiled rotten as a kid. And then his family lost everything and he went to pieces. He span out, he left school, he did drugs, he did alcohol, he got into everything, right? And then on top of that, he got mental illness, and then he got cancer. And at his funeral, one of his friends said to me, he had rosary beads with him when he died, and they're rosary beads that I gave him. And I thought, good on you, well done. We all thought that this guy had drifted completely from his faith, right? But and we still thought he had, right? But 2 months later, his mother rang me, and his mother said to me, I just wanted to tell you that they've brought the box of possessions that he had with him when he died. When I went over to his flat, they took me to his flat when he was there after he died, and I saw him there. And then they packed up those possessions and they sent them over to me. And I just received those possessions, and they contain beautiful things. They contain books about our faith that he was annotating. And secondly, there was a diary in which he wrote only 2 weeks before he died, I just want to die holy. I want to die with a smile on my face. And then she said, and now I know why, when I walked into his room when he was laid out after he died, why he had a smile on his face. In the end, these are little messages, aren't they, that there's something much bigger happening, that you're raising your kids for eternity. You're not raising your kids to be little display items. And kids can go through a tough time. But when the family lost everything, Mum became a Catholic and she started praying for her kids. I was atop Mt Maunganui. And when I was atop Mt Maunganui, I was giving a conference in Taronga. And when I was on the last day, I walked up at dawn to look at the sunrise from Mt Maunganui, and it was beautiful. And then I realized there's a guy behind me coughing, and he's saying, excuse me. And he said, excuse me, you're sitting on my prayer rock. And I thought, whoa, and I hopped up. And he said, I'm the Baptist. He's got his 14-year-old boy there with him. And he says, I'm the Baptist minister, or I think he's a Baptist minister in Taronga, and he points down to the town. And he says, I come up here 3 days a week to pray over my congregation because there's a lot of pain down there. But it's a good thing that our God has big ears. There's great conversation. And his boys, they're listening to all of this, right? And I'm thinking, you champion. And what's the message? When God gives you a responsibility, whether you're the pastor of a village or you're the father or mother of a family, when he gives you a responsibility, he gives you all the wherewithal. I'm a lousy employer if I employ someone and I don't give them the tools of their trade. So God gives you the tools of your trade. There's a spiritual reality that no matter what faith you've got, our Creator gives us all the spiritual goods that we need, because otherwise you'll get beaten to the punch. That's the first thing. Second thing is, all things being equal, it's good for mum to talk to her daughter and dad to talk to the son. All things being equal, because you have more of an intuitive understanding about what the kid's going through. And thirdly, try not to make it a one-off, but to make it an ongoing conversation. And the best book that I know, I think we've talked about it before, but How to Really Love Your Teenager by Jared O'Shea is like a curriculum for conversations over the space of a number of years, regular conversations, not just about sex, but about about life, including sex, and it's a beautiful curriculum to bring you close to your kids.
There's another question here about in terms of critical thinking. You mentioned about how important it is to develop critical thinking in your teenagers. What are a couple of strategies that we could use specifically to develop critical thinking?
Good. I'm happy to share a sheet with you, Jith, which has got sort of 2 pages of ideas on it that you're welcome to pass around. It's a sheet that we used at Redfield. I mean, often it comes down to having a lively dialogue, doesn't it? So, and consulting your kids and helping them understand how to, if they open their heart to you about a problem, for example, then you can help them understand how they can break down that problem into little chunks that they can solve. Also, very, very important idea is to separate truth from opinion. And Jim Stenson on his website, parentleadership.com, has an excellent handout about helping kids make distinctions between feelings and reality and all the other sort of alternatives where one is authentic and one is really the misleading alternative. So they're all good conversation to have with kids. But I'll send those sheets to you.
Okay, great. Does anyone have any other questions? Oh, I've got one coming through here. Andy, have you got any good suggestions for resources for adolescents and teens to read? So not necessarily for the parents, but for the kids themselves.
That's a really good question, because a lot of the young adult fiction that's going is not very good. Well, sorry, I shouldn't say that. Let me put that around. There's plenty of young adult fiction which is not very good. There's also a lot of young adult fiction which is very good. But you need to have your eyes open, I think. I mean, even a lot of the comics now are really gross, you know. It's a bit sad, but you realize that there's a real crisis of truth and goodness in our society, you know. I mean, this idea that we're raising kids to love what is good, true, and beautiful. We've talked about it already, but you know, if you've laid those foundations when the kids are younger and they've had that terminology, there's 100 conversations to have with teenagers about beauty, and teenagers get beauty, whereas kids who are younger than teens don't really get beauty, but teenagers get it. And it's really important to therefore have lots of conversations about how, you know, what is truly beautiful and how we can be drawn to what is truly beautiful, and we should be drawn to what is truly beautiful. I wouldn't baby kids with I mean, kids who are teenagers are capable of reading wonderful literature. So I would try to make sure that we expose them to a lot of really good stuff. I mean, true stories of heroes are fantastic. You know, whether it's the story of Sophie Scholl or 50 other people who've left their mark in the world. I think on the Redfield website, there's a list of suggested readings. I'm pretty sure there is. That's another possible angle of good books for teenagers. But again, Jith, I can send you something if you'd like me to.
Oh, that'd be great. Okay, thanks, Andy. Thank you very much for
Pleasure.
all of the talks that you prepared. And
hey, Nish, I can see your face there now. Good on you. Rebecca, good on you.
Thank you so much. A lot of really great info. Appreciate that a lot. Yeah.
No, not at all. But good to see you, and good to talk across the water to you.
Yes, absolutely. Take care. Thanks so much, Andy.
Okay, and I'm just going to go and put on my green and gold jumper now. Okay.
Well, all the best for that.
We might need it. We might need it. I think you guys are coming back cranky.
Hope so. Thanks, Andy.
Okay. See you later.
Bye.
See you, buddy. See you, Nish.
Bye.
Thanks, Andy.
Hoorah.